in the warm, wavering light of late afternoon, when the prairie lay flat and endless, and the sky seemed to be a thin blue bell that rang without sound. The saloon's swinging doors yielded with a soft, familiar creak, and a trickle of men stepped in, each one carrying the day on his shoulders, a hat rim stained with sweat, boots crusted with dried mud, a face that had learned to squint against sun and dust, offering its low wooden tables, a battered piano tucked against the back wall, rows of bottles that caught and refracted the light, and the smell that wrapped everything together, the deep, clinging perfume of tobacco smoke braided with the iron metal tang of whiskey, and the warm, homey smell of something simmering on the stove that might be beans or stew or something richer when the owner turned a profit. Saloons on the frontier were not temples of refinement, but rather functioning thresholds between the bare bones of outdoor life and the small civilities a town could afford. They were places of gossip and bargaining, of music and gambling, of reconciliations and rivalries. And they were places where food did a kind of quiet, steady work. It kept people alive, softened tempers, created occasions, and, most of all, told a story about the resources and imaginations of the people who lived there. In the earliest towns, the menu was short because the pantry was short. A pot of beans that had been set on the fire before dawn and left to simmer all day. A hunk of salted pork that could be sliced thin and fried until its edges curled. A pan of coarse bread made from the flour that lasted longest on the shelf, and the water that was least apt to make anything spoil. These were the staples that traveled well, that could be preserved without ice when ice was a rare luxury shipped slowly by rail, and that could be bulked up with whatever the local country provided. A deer tagged by a homesteader, a rabbit trapped near the edge of town, a handful of cornmeal that someone's wife had brought in a flour sack. Frontier cooks learned to stretch every ingredient and to coax flavor out of what others might toss aside. The rendered fat from salted pork became cooking oil for potatoes. Drippings preserved in a jar became the difference between a dry biscuit and one that melted in the mouth. And coarse molasses lent enough sweetness to cornbread to make it worth passing along. Coffee was more than refreshment. It was a kind of ritual, boiled over an open flame and poured black into tin cups. It was strong enough to burn the tongue and wake a man at the end of a night's watch. Patrons nursed their cups slowly as they argued about cattle prices or the latest railroad route, because coffee kept conversation going and kept a person anchored to place and habit. Yet the saloon was not a place of overtly domestic comfort for most. Mel dominated in the way most public spaces were in those decades, and its food reflected pragmatic masculinity. Hearty, salty, caloric. Salted beefsteak, when a saloon could afford fresh meat, was often overcooked until it surrendered rather than remained tender, because over a Castian griddle it was safer to reduce the danger of undercooked meat than to risk spoilage in a dusty town. Potatoes were fried in the same pan with the same grease day after day, until they bore the smoky, near-sweet signature of iron and lard, and men came to prize that flavor almost as a mark of the saloon's authenticity. The economic logic was unromantic and cruel in its simplicity. Salty, fried, fatty food makes people thirsty, and thirst means more whiskey sold, and whiskey meant profit. Many saloon keepers were practical economists. As much as they were purveyors of mirth, They priced stew and bread cheaply and bottled spirits at a markup. And the result was an ecosystem in which sustenance and spirits fed each other in a circle that kept the doors open and the piano playing late into the night. At the same time, the foodstuffs that appeared on a saloon table carried the fingerprints of a globalizing world. Immigrants arriving in the West brought recipes and techniques that blended and bent under frontier conditions. The Irish and their stews, hearty and onion-laden. Germans with sausages that were adapted to whatever pork or beef could be cured. Mexican influence that introduced dried child's corn preparations, and a spiciness that became localized into a kind of rustic chili con carne, a dish of tender beef or whatever meat was handy, simmered with chiles or pepper and thickened with flour or cornmeal to create a bowl that could be ladled into eager hands and, in many towns, declared the proprietor's particular pride. The chili that came out of a southwestern saloon was not the carefully spiced, slow-simmered chili of a chef's kitchen. It was a practical, blunt instrument of sustenance, built to feed many mouths and to travel well on a cold night. There were also items that read like frontier ingenuity or mischief, depending on a diner's stomach. Rocky Mountain oysters, in truth. The deep-fried testicles of bulls became a novelty and a bravado dish, served with salt and often accompanied by laughter and a shot of whiskey. Tripe and offal might appear when a rancher insisted that nothing be wasted. And pies, when they came, were sometimes made with fruit preserved in syrup from a summer long since past, or with mincemeat that was more spice and suet than fruit, because what mattered was texture and the comforting bite of pastry rather than the fidelity to recipe. In towns touched by the railroad, there was experimentation and occasional extravagance. Oysters could be shipped in barrels and paraded out as a sign of prosperity, and wealthier saloons might advertise a cut of beef that came in the ice-laden rail cars from eastern packing houses, served with real butter and a brighter confidence. For many towns, though, the arrival of fish in the saloon signaled only that someone had paid heavily for novelty. For most patrons, fish remained an exotic indulgence, while beans and bread and fried potatoes stayed the daily truth. The social choreography around food in the saloon was meaningful. A cowboy who returned with a pocket full of pay might buy a round of beans for his fellows, or a gambler's luck might be buoyed by a plate of stew that steadied his nerves and warmed his hands. Women who worked the saloon as cooks, servers, or entertainers used food as a currency of care, smoothing ruffled tempers with a hot plate and a conversation that both scolded and soothed. And some women who ran boarding houses attached to or near saloons made their reputations on pies so good they caused men to tip beyond mere politeness. Food also lubricated violence. A man full of grease and whiskey had a different temperament from one who arrived hungry and sober. And owners sometimes used the timing of meals to manage crowds, dishing out a hearty supper during tense moments to keep men seated. At night, as fiddle strings thrummed and the piano stamped out a ragtime measure, plates would clatter and knives would mop up last bites, and someone would stand to complain about a late debt or an old grievance. Yet somehow the communal act of eating kept the room from tipping wholly into chaos, because shared food made for shared stories, and stories in turn made for shared obligations. The menus themselves, if one could call them that, reflected the seasons and the supply lines. Fall brought salted pork and preserves. Spring might bring fresh greens if the rains had been kind. And after a successful cattle drive, the saloon might enjoy a temporary feast of salted beef and roasted root vegetables hauled from a wagon. But more often, the table echoed scarcity, with cooks learning to convert the smallest available portion into a bowl that could be passed from hand to hand. Preservation was a frontier art. Salt, smoke, drying, and molasses were the preservatives that stitched together the year, and their flavors infused everything: the smoky bite of cured meat, the cloying cloud of molasses in cornbread, the dusty sweetness of dried apples stewed with cinnamon when the last of the summer fruit was called into service. There were economic actors who shaped what was served, wholesalers who shipped sacks of flour and tins of lard, local ranchers who sold or traded carcasses, and itinerant butchers who might set up for a day to provide a town with fresh cuts that then disappeared into stews and on plates before evening fell. Hospitality mixed with commerce. A saloon would sometimes feed a weary preacher or a stranger for free in the hope of a later favor or a favorable mention, while a raucous dinner during election season might be bankrolled by a local boss who wanted votes. All of these threads, scarcity and ingenuity, commerce and community, the smells and sounds that stitched a room together, made the saloon meal more than simple calories. It was a ritual that held a fragile civilization together, a measure of what people had and a testament to how they made do. When the last plate was scraped and the piano dwindled to a few tired chords, when the lamps guttered and men staggered out into the cool night with bellies full enough to sleep under a sky that seemed impossibly vast, the memory of the saloon's food stayed with them like a faint, warm odor, not a luxury, not a declaration of refinement, but a steady, human thing that meant there was a place in the world where someone would set a pot on the fire and wait until the hungry came home. The story of what people ate in the Wild West is less about recipes and more about resilience, because survival in the frontier was not simply a matter of courage or gunpowder, but also of resourcefulness, the kind that turned scarcity into creativity, hunger into habit, and the rough edges of the land into flavor. When one imagines a saloon kitchen in the 1800s, it is easy to picture chaos, a low-ceilinged room behind swinging doors, thick with smoke and the hiss of boiling pots, a cook in a grease-stained apron working over iron stoves, and the scent of salt, pepper, and frying meat mixing with the dusty air. Ingredients were limited by the distances they had to travel. Fresh vegetables were rare visitors, usually arriving wilted after long trips on wagons or trains that struggled across endless plains. Canned goods existed but were costly, so most cooks turned to dried, salted, and smoked staples, ingredients that could last through heat, drought, and neglect. Beans, cornmeal, flour, lard, salt pork, and coffee were the true pillars of Western dining. Flour was life. Without it, there was no bread, no gravy, no dumplings, no way to stretch a meal. Salted pork and beef provided protein and fat, though more often they were so heavily salted that they had to be boiled multiple times before they were edible. Dried beans were soaked overnight, then simmered slowly for hours until they softened, their plain flavor rescued by bits of bacon or onion when available. Cornmeal, that ancient gift of the Americas, became the great equalizer of frontier cooking. With it, a cook could make bread, porridge, or batter to coat fried meat. Molasses, or syrup, when luck permitted, sweetened the monotony of days that tasted mostly of salt and smoke. These ingredients shaped not only the diet but also the rhythm of life. Mornings began with biscuit dough rising in a drafty corner, afternoons with the crackle of meat in a skillet, and evenings with the slow ladle of stew poured into tin bowls as the piano hummed faintly in the saloon beyond. But food was not only necessity, it was culture transported and transformed. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Mexico, China, and Italy all carried memories of flavors that collided in the frontier pot. Irish laborers taught the habit of thick stews. Chunks of meat and potatoes simmered until tender. Germans introduced sausages and pickled vegetables, though the pickles were often a poor imitation made with vinegar and whatever root vegetables were available. Mexican cooks shared techniques that turned plain beans and corn into richer, spicier dishes. Chili con carne, for example, was born not from wealth, but from adaptation. It took the cheap, tough cuts of meat that others might throw away and simmered them for hours with chili peppers and spices that masked their coarseness. It was humble, efficient, and deeply satisfying, a perfect dish for men who worked long hours and counted their pay in whiskey and cards. The saloons that served chili became famous. Some claimed their recipe could wake the dead, and travelers swore they could smell it cooking half a mile away. The influence of Chinese immigrants was quieter but profound. Many who came to work on the railroads brought with them techniques for quick frying and vegetable preservation. A few drifted into saloon kitchens, where they transformed leftovers into stir-fried dishes using lard instead of sesame oil, blending East and West into something new, what might be called the first American fusion cooking. Still, most cooks were not chefs but survivors. They learned to replace butter with bacon grease, sugar with syrup, and milk with water or condensed substitutes. Eggs, when available, were precious and often stretched thin across batters to make biscuits rise higher. In some saloons, cooks used beer or whiskey in place of water to make doughs richer, both for flavor and practicality. Alcohol sterilized what might otherwise spoil. The result was food that carried the faint echo of the frontier's harshness in every bite. If there was one defining taste of the West, it was smoke. Smoke from burning mesquite, pine, or hickory that clung to every piece of meat, every loaf of bread, and even the clothes of the men who ate it. Meat was smoked for days to preserve it, and that deep, leathery aroma became the perfume of Western life. In some places, cooks even smoked cheese or fish when they could get them, though such delicacies were rare. The more desperate the town, the more inventive the menu. Prairie dogs, rattlesnakes, and even crows found their way into stews during hard times. When settlers faced drought or famine, they turned to anything that moved or grew. A famous joke among frontier men claimed that you could tell how rough a town was by how many legs dinner had. If it had 4 legs, it was good eating. If it had 2, it was probably a bird. If it had none, it might have been a rattlesnake. But these jokes carried truth. Food scarcity united the frontier across class and culture. It reminded everyone of their dependence on the land. When a saloon managed to serve fresh bread or real butter, It was an occasion to celebrate, almost as sacred as a Sunday sermon. Butter was particularly rare because milk soured quickly in the heat and ice was expensive to haul. When available, butter was churned by hand and rationed carefully. The same went for sugar, which arrived in heavy sacks by wagon and was hoarded for pies and coffee. Sometimes cooks faked sweetness by adding molasses to meat glazes or even stirring it into whiskey. The art of substitution became second nature. A cook who couldn't find onions might use wild garlic. One without potatoes might boil cactus roots. It was said that Western cooks could make a feast out of an empty pantry if you just gave them salt, fire, and patience. That spirit of ingenuity became part of the myth of the frontier, not just in gunfights and gold rushes, but in the quiet triumph of making dinner from nothing. Over time, saloon food evolved with the arrival of railroads. Canned peaches, tinned sardines, and condensed milk began to appear. These items were expensive, reserved for paying guests or special occasions, but they transformed the Western palate. Suddenly, the idea of dessert entered saloon menus. A slice of canned fruit served with a dollop of whipped cream if the cook could manage it. Stew pots grew larger, coffee got stronger, and menus became small celebrations of civilization's slow crawl into the wilderness. Still, every dish told the same story: scarcity, endurance, and pride. People of the West didn't just eat to live, they ate to prove they could. Every bite was a small rebellion against the emptiness around them, against the silence of deserts and plains that swallowed the unwary. The saloon meal, simple as it was, carried within it the spirit of an age, rough, smoky, proud, and unkillable. When the sun slid below the horizon and the sky turned to bruised purple and molten gold, the Wild West saloon awakened into something almost alive, breathing through the cracks in its timber walls, humming through piano strings and the scrape of boots across rough floors. The saloon by day was a refuge for the hungry and weary, but by night it became the beating heart of the town, a place where laughter, anger, music, and the clatter of plates mixed with the clink of whiskey glasses until all boundaries between them dissolved into a warm, dusty haze. In the dim lamplight, the smell of food still hung thick in the air: beans and pork, fried potatoes, maybe stew left simmering too long. The scent of bread and grease mingled with smoke and perfume. The same men who had eaten their fill at sunset now leaned over poker tables, their fingers sticky with gravy and ale, while others huddled near the piano, tapping their boots to a tune that barely held together. In this strange mixture of music and hunger, food became more than fuel. It was part of the ritual of living, a reminder of home in a land that had none. The saloon was civilization's fragile imitation, a wooden sanctuary carved out of wilderness. Its tables bore the marks of spilled drinks, knife scratches, and hurried meals, but they also bore the memory of countless conversations, a cowboy whispering to his lover between bites of stew, a drifter negotiating a deal over a plate of beans, a sheriff eating in silence while keeping an eye on the crowd. The act of eating here was communal and performative. No one truly dined alone. Every clink of a spoon and every gulp of whiskey became part of a larger song. The cooks, often unseen behind a curtain or door, were the silent orchestrators of this nightly drama. They knew when to bring food to calm tempers or stall time. They could read the room like a gambler reads cards. If a poker table grew too quiet, they sent out a plate of fried potatoes. If a brawl seemed to simmer, they brought a tray of coffee mugs. It wasn't kindness, it was survival. Because a saloon that kept its patrons eating was less likely to be burned down in a drunken fight. Food softened men, made them human again after long days of being something closer to beasts. Even the roughest cowboy, after a hot meal, could laugh and hum along with the piano before staggering home. The music in these saloons was just as essential as the meals, an emotional seasoning sprinkled over every bite. The pianist, usually a weary man with a half-empty glass balanced on the keys, played songs that were part hymn, part heartbeat. Sometimes a fiddle joined in, sometimes a harmonica, sometimes just the sound of boots stomping in rhythm. Between the melodies, plates clattered, and the sound of forks scraping against tin filled the air. Together, it made a strange, almost sacred music of its own, the soundtrack of a restless people eating, drinking, and forgetting the endless miles of desert waiting outside. But the nights were rarely peaceful for long. A saloon meal could turn into a battleground as easily as it could. Disputes began over cards or women, or sometimes just because two men reached for the same bottle. A chair would scrape, someone would shout, and before long, the same hands that had been holding forks would clutch pistols. Yet, even in chaos, the food lingered, overturned bowls spilling beans onto the floor. Bread torn in half, mid-bite, stew splashed across tables. The cooks and bartenders were used to it. They knew when to duck, when to pour another drink, and when to drag an unconscious cowboy out the back door. And in the quiet aftermath, when the noise died down and someone began sweeping the broken glass, the kitchen fire still glowed, keeping the stew warm for anyone still hungry. That was the strange poetry of the frontier. Violence and hospitality intertwined so tightly they became the same thing. For the women of the saloon, the servers, dancers, or widows who owned the place, food was a kind of armor. They served meals with smiles that could disarm the meanest drunk, and many learned that a well-timed slice of pie could calm a table faster than a gun. Some women built entire reputations from their cooking. There were tales of Miss Clara in Arizona, whose chili was so hot it made grown men cry, or of Lottie in Kansas, who baked apple pies that miners would trade gold dust for. These women were not just cooks. They were keepers of comfort in a world that forgot what comfort meant. Every plate they served was an act of defiance against loneliness. By midnight, the saloon would slow. The piano's notes would grow soft and slurred, like the breath of a tired town. The men who had been loud and proud an hour earlier now leaned on each other, drunk on whiskey and exhaustion. The cook wiped down the counters. The bartender stacked glasses. The last plate of stew cooled beside a flickering lamp. Outside, the wind carried the smell of food and smoke into the dark. Coyotes howled somewhere in the distance, their cries mingling with the fading echoes of laughter inside. It was in those late hours that the saloon revealed its soul, not in its chaos, but in its quiet. The smell of grease and coffee clung to the air like memory. The wood creaked under the weight of 100 footsteps. The plates, the tables, the piano, all of it waited for morning. When the cycle would begin again, hunger, laughter, whiskey, and the slow rhythm of life returning with the sunrise. Food, simple and imperfect, was the thread that tied it all together. It was the taste of survival, the echo of home, and the one small comfort that every wandering soul could claim as their own beneath the endless, indifferent sky of the Wild West. Image prompt: a cinematic night scene inside a lively 19th century Wild West saloon. Piano player performing as cowboys eat and laugh. Waitresses carrying trays of stew and bread. Warm oil lamp light glowing on wooden walls, plates, and whiskey glasses on tables. Smoky, golden atmosphere, cinematic realism, authentic Western mood. When people imagine the Wild West, they picture gunfights under the blazing sun, horses tied to hitching posts, and sheriffs patrolling dusty streets. But behind all those legends lay another, quieter truth. The West was built as much on whiskey as it was on grit. In the saloons that lined frontier towns from Kansas to Nevada, whiskey flowed like lifeblood, poured from barrels into tin cups that clinked in the smoky lamplight as men traded laughter, curses, and memories of home. Alcohol was more than pleasure. It was medicine, money, and meaning rolled into one. The West was an unforgiving place, heat by day, cold by night, loneliness in between, and for men who worked mines, herded cattle, or hunted gold, the saloon's bar was the only sanctuary where the world seemed to pause. The whiskey of the West was rarely pure or aged in the romantic sense. Most of it was harsh, raw, and closer to poison than art. Saloons often received their liquor in barrels shipped from distant cities, but along the way it was diluted, stretched, and sometimes completely reinvented. A barrel-marked Kentucky bourbon might be half alcohol, half river water by the time it reached the frontier. Unscrupulous saloon keepers, eager to save money, cut their whiskey with tobacco juice, molasses, or even turpentine to restore its color and bite. A sip could burn the throat, sear the stomach, and make a man cough. But few complained. It was strong, it was cheap, and it did its job. In many saloons, whiskey was a category rather than a truth. Each establishment had its own concoction, its own ratio of danger to comfort. The so-called tarantula juice was famous for being so potent that it made the drinker feel spiders crawling under his skin, while coffin varnish was a black, bitter spirit rumored to contain industrial alcohol. Men drank it anyway, not out of ignorance, but out of defiance, because drinking in the West wasn't about taste, it was about endurance. To survive there meant to face everything the land threw at you: hunger, dust, storms, and loneliness. Whiskey gave courage, or at least the illusion of it. It numbed the ache of bad luck, softened the blow of lost wagers, and lent bravery to cowboys who might ride into gunfire the next morning. But whiskey was not the only liquid that shaped Western life. Coffee, black as midnight and bitter as a broken promise, was the daily fuel of ranch hands and travelers. It was brewed in large tin pots, often reused for days until the grounds turned to sludge. But no one cared. It was hot, it was strong, and it kept men awake. Water, surprisingly, was harder to come by. Many towns had wells that produced water thick with minerals or mud, and so whiskey and beer were sometimes safer to drink than water itself. Even children and women drank small beer, a weak brew with low alcohol content, because it was less likely to make them sick. Saloons quickly became not only centers of entertainment, but also hubs of hydration, ironic temples, where alcohol quenched thirst in the absence of clean water. And yet, the ritual of drinking was deeply social. The act of raising a glass wasn't just about the liquid. It was about trust, fraternity, and belonging. When a cowboy bought a round, it meant more than generosity. It was an offering of peace. A man's reputation in town could be measured by how many times he shouted "drinks on me," and how many others raised their cups in return. A full saloon echoed with the sound of clinking metal, laughter, and the rhythmic thud of glasses against wood. Women, though fewer in number, were never absent from this culture. Some were barmaids, serving drinks with practiced charm. Others were saloon owners, shrewd and watchful. They understood that whiskey loosened tongues and wallets alike. The cleverest among them diluted the expensive spirits with water or added caramel to darken the color, earning double profit while the customers remained none the wiser. Some even brewed their own moonshine in back rooms, illicit spirits made from corn or rye, distilled in copper kettles under the cover of night. The smell of fermenting mash became as much a part of the West as the sound of boots on the boardwalk. Yet beyond its commerce and corruption, drink held a strange moral weight in the frontier's conscience. Preachers railed against the sin of drunkenness, while towns formed temperance leagues to shut down saloons and rid the streets of vice. But for every sermon that thundered against whiskey, a dozen men slipped into bars as soon as church let out. Hypocrisy was as common as hangovers. The same sheriff who enforced temperance laws might be found slumped over a table by dusk, snoring beside an empty glass. The line between right and wrong blurred with every pore. In the end, alcohol was the great equalizer of the West. It didn't care about class, race, or background. Miners, gamblers, cowboys, and outlaws all shared the same bottles, laughed at the same jokes, and sometimes fought over the same debts. Around the bar, all were temporarily equal. The stories born from those nights, tales of brawls, romances, betrayals, and fortunes, became the oral history of the frontier. Many were lies, exaggerated through the haze of liquor, but even lies held a kind of truth about human longing. Drinking was not just indulgence, it was communion. When the lamps dimmed and the piano grew quiet, when the last pour of the night hit the bottom of a tin cup, the saloon seemed to breathe out a long sigh of relief, as though the entire room had shared the same exhaustion. The men who staggered into the night left behind laughter, secrets, and a few coins on the counter, their shadows stretching thin across the moonlit dust. Behind them, the bartender rinsed the glasses, saving the leftover whiskey to mix into tomorrow's batch. Thus, the cycle continued: thirst, relief, regret, and repetition, a liquid heartbeat that kept the frontier alive. And perhaps that was the most human truth of all. In a world that offered so little comfort, whiskey was not just escape. It was memory, a taste of courage, bitterness, and belonging that no man could ever quite forget. In the heart of every Wild West town, no matter how small or dusty, the bartender was the quiet king of the saloon, a man whose steady hands poured not only whiskey but wisdom, whose ears gathered secrets that could buy life or cost it. He was part confidant, part doctor, part priest, and sometimes part undertaker. Behind the counter of scratched wood and brass rails, the bartender presided over a world that never truly slept. The piano might falter, the lamps might flicker, but the bar itself never rested. Each night, a river of humanity flowed in and out. Gamblers, drifters, sheriffs, preachers, and sometimes women with eyes like sharpened glass. And it was the bartender who stood unshaken amid it all, holding the rhythm steady with the soft clink of glass against bottle. Serving drinks in the Old West was not a simple task. It was performance, ritual, and survival combined. A good bartender could pour a shot without spilling a drop, even as bullets flew. He could read faces faster than cards, knowing who was about to draw their gun and who just needed another drink to forget their sorrow. He didn't just sell liquor, he sold silence, understanding, and the illusion of safety in a place where safety was scarce. Every pour, every drink was a story. Whiskey wasn't the only liquid to cross those counters, though it was the most famous. Beer, or what passed for it, was often brewed in crude back rooms using malt syrup, sugar, and whatever grains the town could afford. Refrigeration was rare, so beer was served warm, flat, and often cloudy. Still, when poured into a frothy mug, it gave the tired men of the frontier a sense of luxury they rarely knew. In mining towns, the first beer shipment, after a long drought of supplies, could bring more joy than gold itself. The bar was more than a place of consumption. It was a stage. The shelves behind the counter gleamed with bottles of amber, green, and brown glass, some filled with genuine whiskey, others with homemade imitation. Decorative mirrors reflected the chaos, making the room seem larger, brighter, and somehow grander than it was. A single piano tune, a laugh from the back room, and the bartender's hand polishing a glass. Together, these were the heartbeat of the saloon. There were rules, too, unspoken but ironclad. Never insult the bartender, never question his pour, and never, under any circumstances, reach behind the counter. The man who broke these rules often found himself face down on the street before sunrise. Bartenders were rarely armed openly, but most kept a shotgun under the counter and a revolver within reach. They'd seen too much to trust anyone's sobriety. Still, the best of them didn't need weapons. They ruled with presence alone, calm eyes, slow words, and the kind of voice that could cut through a brawl like thunder. Their power was subtle but absolute. In many ways, the bartender was the historian of the West. He watched men rise and fall, fortunes bloom and vanish, friendships form and shatter, all over glasses of whiskey and words half forgotten by dawn. He remembered who cheated at cards, who owed money, and who lied about their name. Some men believed the bartender was just another worker, but the wise ones knew better. The saloon might belong to the owner, but it ran on the bartender's judgment. Behind every famous outlaw or drifter story, there was usually a bartender who poured the drink that set it in motion. And while whiskey was king, there were other spirits that flavored the West's nights. Gin imported from the East, rum smuggled from the coast, and brandy reserved for the wealthy or the lucky. Some saloons experimented with cocktails long before the modern bar scene existed. Snakebite, Prairie Dew, and gunpowder grog were among the names whispered by regulars. These were mixtures of whatever was on hand: whiskey, sugar, bitters, vinegar, even gunpowder, in one notorious case, meant to shock the tongue and impress the company. Every drink came with a tale, every sip with a wager. In fancier towns, bartenders prided themselves on style. They wore waistcoats, waxed mustaches, and sometimes gold watches. Their hands moved like dancers, pouring 2 drinks at once while chatting about the weather or the latest bounty. They knew that part of a drink's magic was in the show. The flick of the wrist, the ring of the glass, the confident smile. In rougher settlements, bartenders wore aprons blackened with soot, sweat, and spilled whiskey. But even there, a certain dignity remained. For in the West, where everything was fleeting, gold, youth, love, and even life, the bar stood as a kind of permanence. The bartender, in his quiet authority, became the town's spine. Yet his life was lonely. When the last man stumbled home and the piano stopped, he cleaned in silence, wiping the same counter he had wiped 1,000 nights before. The smell of whiskey clung to his hands like a second skin. He knew every face that passed through his saloon, but few knew his name. He was a witness to all: weddings, shootings, laughter, heartbreak, and yet he belonged to none of it. Still, he returned every dawn, ready to pour again, ready to listen again, ready to serve the endless hunger that the frontier carried in its bones. To drink in the Wild West was to taste both the sweetness of freedom and the bitterness of isolation. And no one understood that duality better than the man behind the bar. Every bottle he uncorked was a confession waiting to happen. Every glass a temporary escape from the dust and the silence that ruled the plains beyond. In that dim glow of oil lamps and shadow, the bartender reigned as the unspoken poet of the Wild West. His verses made not of words, but of whiskey, poured steady and slow into waiting hands. When dawn crept across the plains and the first gray light spilled through cracked saloon shutters, the Wild West looked nothing like the wild night before. The laughter, gunfire, and music faded into memory, replaced by the soft groans of men waking up with heads heavy as saddlebags and mouths dry as the desert wind. The morning after, in a western town, was its own kind of reckoning, a slow, painful return to reality. Dust still hung in the air from last night's fights, the floorboards sticky with spilled whiskey, the piano silent but scarred from a brawl that had tipped it sideways. The bartender, weary-eyed and slow-moving, swept broken glass into piles while flies buzzed over half-eaten plates of beans. For every drink poured under the glow of lanterns, there was a price to pay when the sun rose, and no one escaped it. Hangovers in the Old West weren't the mild headaches of a modern age. They were brutal, all-consuming battles between man and his own excess. The whiskey was so raw and impure that it could leave a man dizzy for days. Some woke with trembling hands, others with no memory of how they'd gotten home. There were stories of cowboys who found themselves miles outside town, lying in their saddles while their horses somehow remembered the way. There were men who woke in jail, their pockets empty, their guns missing, and their pride shattered. The saloon, once a place of laughter and escape, became a house of quiet guilt in the daylight. The morning air carried the faint scent of smoke, coffee, and regret. Those who could still walk returned to nurse their aching stomachs with the frontier's rough version of a cure. A tin mug of black coffee, thick enough to stand a spoon upright in, or a hair of the dog, a small shot of whiskey meant to chase away the demons left by the night. Some swore by raw eggs mixed with vinegar, others by chewing ginger root, and a few desperate souls soaked bread in whiskey again, believing that the poison that caused the sickness could somehow cure it. None of it truly worked, but it gave them something to cling to, a ritual, a small rebellion against their own weakness. Outside, the streets were quiet, except for the creak of wagons and the slow steps of those heading to work. The same men who had gambled away their pay or started fistfights just hours ago now carried buckets of water or repaired fences in silence. The women swept their porches, shaking their heads at the familiar sight of hungover cowboys stumbling past. The town, in its strange way, forgave. It always did. The saloon was cleaned, the tables straightened, the piano righted, and by evening, everything would begin again. There was something almost poetic about that endless loop of excess and redemption, a rhythm that defined the frontier's spirit. They worked hard, played harder, and forgot everything the next morning. But for some, the hangover wasn't just physical. The quiet daylight brought thoughts they had drowned the night before, memories of loved ones left behind, letters unopened, dreams unfulfilled. In the harsh clarity of sunrise, men saw themselves not as cowboys or gamblers, but as lonely souls chasing the next distraction. The West, vast and untamed, had a way of amplifying solitude. Whiskey had filled the silence for a while, but morning stripped it all bare. There were mornings when the preacher would walk past the saloon, Bible in hand, shaking his head at the sight of bottles lined up in the trash. He'd preach about sin and salvation, and some men listened, nodding, vowing to quit drinking forever. By nightfall, they were back at the bar. The bartender knew better than to judge. He'd seen it all before. He cleaned the same messes, poured the same drinks, and offered the same comfort in the same tin cups. There was no moral to the cycle, no grand lesson to be learned. It was simply life, messy, raw, and repetitive, like the land itself. The hangover wasn't just the body's rebellion. It was the soul's reminder of how thin the line between escape and despair really was. And yet, even through the haze of sickness, there was beauty in the routine. The morning sun turned the dust golden, coffee steamed in chipped mugs, and somewhere a horse neighed softly in the distance. A few laughed at their misfortunes, trading stories about who had passed out where, who had started the last fight, and who had won the final hand of poker. Laughter, even weak and hungover, was their redemption. They were survivors of the land of violence and of their own vices. By noon, the saloon was ready again. Fresh barrels rolled in, tables wiped clean, and the smell of stew replaced the stench of stale beer. The bartender lit the lamps early, not because night had come, but because he knew it would. And as the shadows stretched across the floor, he took one last look at the quiet room, at the sunlight spilling through the windows, and muttered the same words he did every day: "Here we go again." Because in the West, life didn't move in straight lines. It circled like the endless horizon, day chasing night, hangover chasing whiskey, memory chasing forgetfulness. And through it all, the saloon stood eternal, a wooden cathedral where men confessed not with words, but with the tilt of a glass. In the end, it wasn't the drinking that defined them, but the waking up, the stubborn, unbroken act of rising again after the world spun out of control. That, more than anything, was the real courage of the frontier. When the open plains stretched endlessly under a burning sun and the nearest saloon lay miles away, the men and women of the Wild West turned the land itself into their kitchen, crafting meals from dust, determination, and whatever scraps they could carry in their saddlebags. Life on the frontier was not for the delicate. Every bite of food was earned through sweat and grit. Every fire-built meal a small act of triumph over hunger and hardship. Cowboys, settlers, and wanderers all knew the art of making something out of nothing. They traveled long distances across barren landscapes where the wind tasted of salt and sand, their only companions being the creak of leather saddles and the low moan of distant coyotes. When night fell, they stopped wherever there was wood enough to spark a fire, tying their horses and unpacking the same few staples that kept them alive: beans, bacon, coffee, and biscuits. These were the cornerstones of frontier cuisine, so simple yet so vital that they became symbols of endurance. The cowboy's most faithful companion after his horse was the chuck wagon, a rolling kitchen built from ingenuity. Its drawers held flour, coffee, dried fruit, salt, and occasionally sugar, if luck permitted. Hanging from its sides were iron pots blackened by fire, each one carrying the flavor of 100 previous meals. The cook, often called Cookie, ruled this moving restaurant with an iron ladle and a sharper tongue. To insult the cook was to invite starvation, for he decided who got the crispiest bacon and who got the burned biscuits. The chuck wagon was more than a kitchen. It was the beating heart of every cattle drive, the one place where laughter, food, and stories were shared after endless days of dust and exhaustion. Cowboys gathered around the fire, their faces glowing in the flickering light, and ate in silence first, then spoke only when the worst of their hunger had been tamed. The meals themselves were humble but hearty. Beans were the foundation, pinto or kidney, soaked overnight and boiled with bits of salt, pork, or bacon. The smoky flavor clung to the air, mixing with the scent of campfire and sweat. Coffee, brewed in a black pot that was never truly clean, came next, thick, bitter, and powerful enough to wake the dead. It was poured into tin cups, still hot from the fire, drunk without sugar or cream. For those luxuries belonged to cities, not the wild. Sometimes, if the herd had done well or the men had been paid, Cookie might surprise them with dried apples cooked into a cobbler or flapjacks fried in bacon grease. That sweetness, rare and fleeting, reminded the men that civilization still existed somewhere beyond the horizon. Meat, when they had it, came from cattle, deer, rabbit, or whatever the rifle provided. Cowboys learned to make jerky long strips of salted meat dried in the sun, which could last weeks without spoiling. It was tough as leather, but filling, and they chewed it slowly while riding, letting the salt keep them awake under the sun's glare. Sometimes they hunted wild game, like prairie chickens or turkeys, roasting them whole over open flames. The smell of roasting meat was enough to draw every man within miles to the campfire. Bread was scarce, but not absent. Sourdough was a frontier favorite, made from wild yeast and flour, kept alive in a small jar of starter that some cooks treated like gold. If the cook died, someone else would inherit his sourdough, like an heirloom. With this dough, they made biscuits or skillet bread, baked directly in cast iron pots buried under coals. The crust came out smoky and hard, but the inside stayed warm and soft, perfect for sopping up the last of the beans. Butter was rare, so bacon grease took its place. Everything tasted of salt, smoke, and effort, the flavors of survival. Not all frontier meals were noble, however. Many travelers, desperate and far from towns, ate what they could find: roots, cactus pads, or lizards, roasted over tiny fires. Native tribes had long known how to make such ingredients edible, and many settlers learned from them. Mesquite beans became a kind of flour, acorns were ground and soaked, and even grasshoppers were roasted for protein when times grew desperate. The frontier was a teacher with harsh lessons. Those who adapted survived, and those who didn't were buried under the dust. Yet even in hardship, the people of the West found ways to make meals meaningful. Around the fire, cowboys swapped tales of lost loves and distant lands, of gunfights and ghost towns, of fortunes found and lost again. Every meal became a gathering, a communion in a world that had none of the comforts of home. There was laughter, teasing, and sometimes quiet moments of reflection. The crackle of fire filling the gaps where words failed. Food was more than sustenance. It was memory, the taste of the past clinging to each mouthful. Coffee, in particular, held sacred status. It was the first thing made at dawn and the last before bed. A cowboy could forgive many things, but a weak cup of coffee was not among them. Even when beans ran low, they reused the same grounds again and again, adding water until the brew turned pale and sad, yet still they drank it with gratitude. That bitter liquid was hope in a cup. As the night deepened, coyotes sang in the distance, and the men stretched out under the stars, bellies full and hearts at ease for the first time all day. The fire burned low, sending sparks into the vast black sky, and Cookie cleaned his pots in silence. Tomorrow would bring more dust, more miles, and more hunger, but for now they were fed, and that was enough. The Wild West was a place of constant motion, and its meals reflected that. Quick, practical, resilient. The flavors were born from scarcity, but they carried a strange richness, the richness of freedom, of working hands, of men and women who carved their meals and their futures from the unforgiving earth itself. The Wild West was not a place for the faint-hearted, and nowhere was this more evident than in the empty stretches between towns, where hunger became both companion and enemy. For every bustling saloon or busy chuck wagon, there were endless miles of wilderness where food was a question, not a guarantee. Travelers, trappers, outlaws, and settlers crossing these lands often faced weeks without proper supplies, surviving on what the land would offer or what desperation forced them to eat. Out here, cooking was stripped of comfort and invention. It was a fight for calories, a daily negotiation between man and nature. The wind howled across the plains, carrying dust and silence, and every campfire meal became a quiet testament to endurance. The ingredients of survival were meager and unforgiving: dried meat, hardtack biscuits, and the occasional wild plant. Hardtack, that infamous rock-hard bread made of flour, salt, and water, was the frontier's cruel answer to hunger. Soldiers had eaten it during the Civil War, and settlers carried it westward, gnawing on it until their teeth ached. To make it edible, Travelers soaked it in coffee or stew, softening it just enough to chew. Some joked that hardtack could break a jaw. Others swore it could stop a bullet. Yet it kept people alive, and that was all that mattered. Alongside hardtack came jerky, tough, salty strips of beef, buffalo, or venison, dried in the sun. A man could ride for days with a few pieces of jerky in his saddlebag, each bite a small victory against starvation. In the dead heat of summer, the smell of drying meat filled the air around every camp, attracting flies, wolves, and sometimes desperate men willing to steal. But jerky was worth it. It lasted, and in the frontier, anything that lasted was sacred. When even jerky ran out, people turned to what the wilderness offered. Prairie turnips, wild onions, and cattail roots became delicacies for those who knew where to find them. Native tribes had long mastered the art of living off the land, and many settlers learned from their wisdom, roasting cactus pads to remove the thorns, grinding mesquite pods into a sweet powder, or baking grass seeds into simple cakes. The land, though harsh, was generous to those who respected it, but not everyone did. Many travelers went hungry because they refused to eat what they called savage food, clinging instead to the scraps of civilization they'd brought. Pride was a poor meal, and the West had a way of punishing it. There were stories whispered by campfires of wagon trains caught in blizzards, of men lost in canyons, of families forced to boil leather or chew bark to survive. These were not just tales of misfortune, but of humanity stripped bare. Hunger revealed character in ways no gunfight could. For every tale of tragedy, there were also legends of ingenuity. Prospectors in the mountains made stews from snowmelt, dried beans, and anything they could hunt: rabbits, squirrels, even birds unlucky enough to cross their path. They called it mountain stew, though it was less a recipe than a gamble. If the meat was fresh, it was hearty. If not, it was misery in a pot. Yet when the snow piled high and the wind screamed through the trees, even misery could taste like salvation. Food scarcity also shaped culture. Communities that survived shared recipes that blended necessity with creativity. Pioneers learned to fry cornmeal into simple flatbreads, to make soup from bones, to sweeten meals with molasses instead of sugar. Nothing was wasted. Bones became broth. Bacon fat became flavoring. Even coffee grounds were reused until the pot turned gray. Hunger taught thrift, and thrift built resilience. In mining camps, men pooled their rations, taking turns cooking meals that barely passed as edible but always filled the belly. The miner's stew, a chaotic mix of beans, salt pork, potatoes, and sometimes tin-canned tomatoes, became the lifeblood of every boomtown. When the gold dried up, they joked that at least the stew never ran out. The truth was that hunger united them. Around the fire, men shared not only food, but stories, songs, and scraps of hope. The act of eating together became sacred, a reminder that survival was a collective effort. No one lasted long in the West alone. The same principle held true for the women who journeyed across the plains, their aprons tied tight, their hands rough from work. They baked bread in iron pots buried in coals, stirred beans for hours, and stretched meager ingredients into feasts that fed entire wagon trains. For them, food was love made visible, a way to nurture life amid hardship. Children born on the trail often tasted their first food from these rough campfires, learning early that warmth and hunger lived side by side. As night fell, the wilderness seemed to swallow sound itself. The stars stretched endlessly overhead, cold and watchful, while the last embers of the fire glowed like dying eyes. A man could feel small out there, smaller than he'd ever felt before. And food, even a mouthful of beans or a crust of bread, became a comfort that tethered him to existence. In those moments, the act of eating was not indulgence, but defiance. To chew was to say, "I am still here." Hunger, though cruel, gave meaning to the simplest meal. When dawn came and the world turned gold again, travelers packed what little they had left and rode on, chasing distant horizons. They carried with them not just supplies, but stories of hunger endured, of fires that refused to die, of taste and will intertwined. And though they rarely thought of it this way, their humble meals were shaping a nation's character, one forged not in feasts, but in scarcity. The Wild West's true flavor was not sweetness or spice, but survival. The taste of dust, smoke, and courage, lingering on every tongue that dared to keep going. As the dust of the frontier slowly settled and the Wild West began to civilize, the scent of food shifted from the smoky campfires of survival to the more refined aromas drifting from saloon kitchens, boarding houses, and city restaurants. This was the transformation of the West itself, from wild hunger to comfort, from necessity to indulgence. The men who had once eaten beans by moonlight now found themselves sitting at tables covered with linen, their spoons clinking against porcelain, and their meals prepared not by desperate hands, but by hired cooks who understood the art of taste. Yet even as refinement came, the memory of scarcity lingered in every bite. It was impossible to forget the taste of dust and hardtack when luxury arrived so late. The new frontier cuisine was not imported from Europe. It was born of the land, evolved from hardship, and spiced with gratitude. Cattle towns like Dodge City, Abilene, and Tombstone became hubs of trade and culture, where beef ruled supreme. The cattle drives from Texas filled saloon kitchens with fresh meat, and soon steak and stew replaced jerky and beans as staples. Thick slabs of beef cooked over open flame became a symbol of the West's triumph, hearty, smoky, and dripping with the satisfaction of civilization. Saloons began advertising hot meals served daily, a luxury unimaginable just decades earlier. Behind swinging doors, men who had once slept under stars now gathered for dinner under the glow of oil lamps. They ordered roast beef, baked potatoes, biscuits, and gravy, the holy trinity of frontier comfort. The smell of sizzling fat filled the air, mingling with tobacco smoke and laughter. The cook, often a gruff ex-soldier or an immigrant with strong arms and stronger opinions, stirred pots that represented the new spirit of the West, a mixture of cultures and flavors, all seasoned by survival. Immigrants brought with them recipes that forever changed Western food. The Chinese, who had helped build the railroads, opened small eateries serving noodles, stir-fried meats, and tea, foreign flavors that startled cowboys but slowly won their affection. The Mexicans introduced chili con carne, tamales, and tortillas, dishes that burned the tongue but warmed the heart. German immigrants brought sausages and sauerkraut, while the Irish contributed stews thick with potatoes and onions. Each meal was a meeting point of worlds. A quiet reminder that America's West was not conquered by guns alone, but by appetite, adaptation, and community. Women, too, became the backbone of this culinary evolution. In boarding houses and home kitchens, they taught men how to bake bread, preserve fruit, and prepare meals that reminded them of family and warmth. The famous boarding house suppers became an institution. Long wooden tables covered in roast chicken, mashed potatoes, cornbread, and pies filled with whatever fruit could be found. For lonely travelers, these meals were more than food. They were memory and mercy served on a plate. The saloon, once known only for whiskey and gambling, adapted to this growing domesticity. By evening, men could still find trouble at the card tables, but by midday they could order lunch, meat pies, oyster stew for the wealthy, or even freshly baked bread. Some saloons prided themselves on offering ladies' meals, delicate plates of ham sandwiches, coffee, and cake, served in separate dining rooms to preserve respectability. The West was softening, not in spirit, but in appetite. Yet, for all its refinement, the frontier never fully shed its roughness. Supplies were still scarce, refrigeration was unreliable, and creativity remained essential. A skilled cook could turn salt, pork, beans, and wild herbs into a dish worthy of praise. They cooked with instinct, guided not by recipes but by experience, taste, and hunger's memory. The ingredients may have improved, but the philosophy remained the same: waste nothing, savor everything. Food was still the measure of a person's grit. Even the towns that grew rich from mining or cattle trade kept their rustic charm. Wooden buildings, muddy streets, and the ever-present smell of smoke reminded everyone that civilization was still young here. A diner might enjoy roast duck one night and go hungry the next if the supply wagon didn't arrive. But that unpredictability was the essence of the West, always testing, always teaching resilience. Food became a storyteller, carrying within it the history of the land. Every dish on the table was a narrative: beans telling of cowboys, bread of pioneers, chili of borderlands, coffee of sleepless travelers, whiskey of risk and regret. Even luxury meals in new western cities like San Francisco or Denver carried the ghosts of the plains. The oysters, imported by rail, reminded diners of progress, but the way they were eaten quickly, gratefully, sometimes greedily, revealed the same old hunger beneath. In many ways, the West's food culture became a metaphor for the people themselves, raw, adaptive, and honest. The meals of the late 19th century reflected a society trying to balance comfort with courage. The days of starving trappers and wagon train dinners were fading, replaced by the clink of forks and the hum of conversation. Yet, under it all was a collective memory that refused to disappear, that once food had meant survival. Perhaps that is why Western cuisine, even today, favors simplicity over sophistication. A cowboy steak, a pot of beans, cornbread, black coffee, these endure not out of nostalgia, but out of reverence. They remind us of the men and women who crossed deserts and mountains with little more than fire and faith. When the frontier finally tamed and the railroads stretched like veins across the continent, civilization came with kitchens instead of guns. The campfire, though, remained eternal. Even in the heart of new Western cities, people would still gather around flames to cook, to talk, to remember, because in the end, It was not gold or glory that built the West. It was the shared act of breaking bread under endless skies, the quiet triumph of taste over turmoil, and the humble comfort of knowing that as long as food was warm and stories were told, no one was truly alone. Behind the swinging doors of every Wild West saloon was a world most never saw, a world of smoke, sweat, and sizzling pans, where the true backbone of frontier civilization labored in obscurity, while cowboys gambled and gunmen drank themselves into legends. The cooks, servers, and dishwashers kept the blood of the saloon flowing its food. The sound of laughter and piano music out front was matched by the clatter of plates and the hiss of grease in the back. It was here, in the narrow, dimly lit kitchens, that the story of Western cuisine took its most human form. Saloon kitchens were small, usually no bigger than a stable stall, their walls blackened by smoke and their floors slick with spilled lard. The heat from the wood-fired stoves turned the air into a thick, greasy fog that clung to everything: walls, clothes, skin. A single cook, sometimes two if the owner could afford it, ran the show like a general at war. He woke before dawn, chopping wood, stirring beans, and butchering meat brought in from nearby ranches. These men were not chefs in the European sense. They were survivalists with spoons instead of guns. Most had no recipes, only instinct learned from years of cooking over campfires and chuck wagons. They measured with their eyes, tasted with their fingers, and cursed with creativity when ingredients ran out. Flour, lard, salt, coffee, and beef. These were the pillars of the Western kitchen. From them, entire menus were built. Breakfasts were heavy: fried eggs, bacon, biscuits drenched in gravy, and coffee so strong it could wake the dead. Lunches leaned toward practicality: beans, stew, and bread that could be eaten standing up. Dinners were indulgent by comparison, featuring roasted meats, potatoes, pies, and occasionally something exotic like oysters brought by train from San Francisco. To the traveler, it felt like luxury. To the cook, it was another day's survival. The saloon cook rarely received praise. If the food was good, the credit went to the owner. If bad, the blame fell squarely on the man at the stove. But for all the hardship, these kitchens produced flavors that would become timeless. One signature dish was the cowboy steak, a thick slab of beef cooked directly on cast iron, seasoned with nothing but salt and pepper, its edges charred and its center juicy. Another was the son-of-a-gun stew, a hearty mixture of beef tripe, marrow, vegetables, and whatever else could be found. It was said that no two bowls ever tasted the same, and perhaps that was the point. Every cook added something personal: a pinch of spice, a splash of whiskey, a handful of wild herbs. Food was an expression of self in a land where identity was often blurred by dust and drink. The saloon kitchen was also a crossroads of cultures. Immigrant cooks brought with them techniques and ingredients that transformed Western meals. A Chinese cook might steam dumplings beside a pot of chili. A Mexican woman might add chili peppers to beef stew. An Irishman might bake soda bread using local cornmeal. The result was a chaotic symphony of flavor, not refined, but alive. It was the taste of a country in the making, stitched together by hunger and hope. Many saloon cooks were ex-soldiers who who had learned to feed armies with scraps, or freed slaves who carried with them deep traditions of Southern cooking. Their influence gave Western food its heart, rich gravies, smoked meats, and an understanding that food was more than sustenance. It was memory, identity, and quiet rebellion. Inside these kitchens, people of all races worked side by side long before the rest of the nation did. The heat of the stove burned away prejudice, if only for a moment. A good cook was respected, regardless of skin color, because when the dinner bell rang, everyone depended on him. The noise of the saloon above, the laughter, shouting, clinking glasses, became a rhythm for those below. Some cooks learned to time their meals to the mood of the night. A lively crowd meant fast meals. A quiet night meant slower, richer cooking. Food became part of the saloon's entertainment, the unspoken companion to whiskey and music. The first bite of hot stew after a long ride, the crack of a biscuit in strong coffee, the sweetness of molasses on a plate of cornbread. These were small luxuries that made the chaos of the frontier bearable. The saloon kitchen also held secrets, whispered between pots and pans. Recipes were guarded like gold, passed down quietly or carried away by cooks when they left town. Some claimed to use rattlesnake meat in their stew for strength. Others swore by adding a splash of bourbon to everything for the soul. Many of these secrets died with their creators, leaving behind only faint echoes of flavor that modern historians try in vain to recreate. But perhaps that's what made Western food so magical. It was never about precision, only survival and story. Even as the West grew more civilized, the saloon kitchen remained wild at heart. Electricity and refrigeration would one day tame it, but in the 19th century, it was still raw, unpredictable, and alive with energy. Every meal was a gamble, much like life outside the saloon doors. Yet amid the chaos, there was artistry, a beauty in imperfection, a poetry in smoke and sweat. By midnight, when the last drunk stumbled out and the piano went silent, the cook would finally step into the cool night air, wiping his hands on a stained apron. The stars above the dusty street shimmered faintly, and for a brief moment, the world seemed quiet. He'd light a cigarette, take a slow breath, and listen to the distant sound of boots on the boardwalk. Another day was over, another 100 mouths fed. Tomorrow would bring the same grind, the same beans, the same bacon, the same endless hunger. But deep down, he knew something that few others did, that the story of the Wild West was not written by gunfighters or gamblers, but by the men and women who kept the kitchens burning, who turned chaos into comfort, and who, in their own humble way, fed a nation being born out of hunger and grit. In the shadow of gunslingers, outlaws, and railroad tycoons, there stood another kind of pioneer, women whose stories rarely made the history books, but whose hands shaped the taste and tenderness of the Wild West. They were the quiet queens of the kitchen and the hearth, the keepers of warmth in a world built on dust and danger. While men tamed the land with rifles and ambition, women conquered it with fire, flour, and patience. Their kitchens were not grand, nor were their tools fancy. But in those small spaces, filled with the scent of baking bread and simmering stew, civilization quietly took root. Every meal cooked by a frontier woman was an act of defiance against hunger, against hardship, and against the harsh indifference of the wilderness. In the early days, when wagon trains creaked across endless plains, women learned to cook with what little they could carry: flour, bacon, beans, coffee, and salt. These were the building blocks of life. They baked bread in Dutch ovens, buried in hot coals, fried biscuits in cast-iron skillets, and stirred stews that stretched meager ingredients into miracles. Their recipes were not written but remembered, passed from mother to daughter through gestures and glances. A handful of this, a pinch of that. In their hands, survival became artistry. On the trail, food was both sustenance and solace. After long days of travel, families gathered around campfires, and it was the women who turned fatigue into comfort, transforming smoke and scarcity into something almost sacred. A simple pot of beans could feel like home. Children fell asleep to the sound of crackling firewood and the soft scraping of a spoon against a metal pot. These sounds, mundane, repetitive, eternal, were the heartbeat of the frontier. When settlements grew into towns, women established the first boarding houses and bakeries, introducing warmth and order into places defined by chaos. They fed miners, ranchers, lawmen, and drifters, men who hadn't tasted a home-cooked meal in months. For a few coins, these men could buy more than food. They could buy a brief return to humanity. The women served chicken stew, mashed potatoes, corn fritters, pies filled with wild berries, and coffee, brewed black and strong. Their food carried something that whiskey never could: comfort without regret. In many saloons and inns, women worked as cooks and servers, often running the entire establishment, while the male owners gambled or drank away profits. These women were tough, proud, and unyielding. They faced ridicule and danger daily, but in their kitchens, they ruled absolutely. The clang of pots and the hiss of frying grease became their battle songs. They worked before sunrise and after midnight, their aprons stained, but their spirits unbroken. Their labor transformed the Wild West from a wilderness into a home. Some of these women became legends in their own right. In Texas, Mary Fields, known as Stagecoach Mary, once ran a kitchen that fed travelers and mail carriers alike. In California, Chinese-American women opened tea houses, serving meals that blended Eastern delicacy with Western hunger. In Kansas, freed black women ran boarding houses that became safe havens for travelers of every color, their tables uniting people in ways laws refused to put. These unsung heroines carried not just recipes, but revolutions in their aprons. The food they cooked became a symbol of equality, love, and survival in a land where all three were scarce. Cooking, for them, was not merely duty, it was creation. Each loaf of bread, each pot of stew was an assertion of existence, a message that life could be gentle even here. They learned to use everything the land gave: wild herbs, prairie fruits, cornmeal, and beans, and from them built flavors that would define American comfort food for generations. Cornbread sweetened with molasses, apple pie with flaky crusts, biscuits soaked in gravy. All of these began as frontier inventions. And when meat was scarce, they turned to ingenuity, frying dough into sinkers, baking potato peel pies, or using bacon fat to flavor vegetables. In their kitchens, waste was a sin, and creativity was survival. Beyond their culinary skills, women also brought community. They organized church suppers, harvest feasts, and barn dances, events where the smell of food mingled with laughter and music. These gatherings were the glue that held towns together. Around tables laden with casseroles and cobblers, people forgot their rivalries and remembered their shared humanity. It was the women who made these moments possible, feeding not just the body, but the soul of the West. Yet their work was often invisible, their names lost to time. History celebrated the sheriffs and saloon owners, but forgot the hands that kneaded the dough, the hearts that kept the fire burning through endless winters. Still, their influence endures in every diner, every ranch kitchen, every recipe that begins with "my grandmother used to make this." They were the first chefs, the first entrepreneurs, the first comfort givers of the American frontier. When night fell and the prairie wind moaned through the gaps in wooden walls, it was their stew bubbling softly on the fire that turned fear into calm. The West may have been conquered by guns, but it was built, truly built, by the women who cooked. Their kitchens were sanctuaries of survival, their meals prayers in disguise. They didn't just feed the hungry, they nourished a nation learning to grow from chaos into care. In every warm biscuit and every slice of pie, you can still taste their legacy, resilience, tenderness, and the quiet power of those who shaped history from behind the stove. For all its hardship and hunger, the Wild West also knew moments of joy, and nothing expressed that better than the rare occasions when people came together to feast. These weren't feasts of luxury or excess like those in eastern cities. They were born of sweat, gratitude, and survival. When the crops finally came in, when cattle drives returned home, or when a town was founded or saved, the people of the frontier gathered around long wooden tables or open fires to share what they had. The West's feasts were raw, loud, smoky, and full of life. There were no chandeliers, no silverware, no orchestras, only the sound of laughter, boots stomping, fiddles playing, and the smell of food thick in the air. Every dish told a story, and every bite was a reminder of how far they had come. The most common celebration in frontier life was the harvest feast held at the end of long, grueling seasons. Settlers brought whatever their land had given: corn, beans, squash, potatoes, wild game, and preserves stored since spring. Men slaughtered pigs or cattle, smoking the meat for hours until the air itself tasted of fire. Women baked pies, biscuits, and cobblers filled with berries picked from the edges of creeks. Children churned butter by hand, their arms aching but their smiles wide. When the meal was served, everyone, from the richest ranch owner to the poorest drifter, sat side by side, united by food and fatigue. There was an understanding among them that life on the frontier did not promise abundance often. So when it came, it had to be savored. The dishes were simple but meaningful: roasted venison with herbs, beans stewed with bacon, cornbread golden and crisp, apple pies cooled on windowsills. Some towns added local flair. In Texas, feasts often featured chili con carne, simmered for hours until thick and smoky. In California, seafood brought inland by rail was served with garlic and wine. In New Mexico, tortillas and tamales turned every celebration into a fusion of cultures. Food became the language that bridged differences. Around those tables, former soldiers sat beside immigrants, cowboys beside farmers, and the laughter that rose from their gathering was the sound of peace, however brief. One of the grandest traditions was the cattleman's barbecue, a communal feast celebrating the end of a successful drive. Whole sides of beef were roasted in pits dug into the ground, seasoned with salt and mesquite smoke. The aroma could travel for miles, drawing people from nearby ranches and towns. Barrels of beans, pots of coffee, and mountains of bread completed the spread. Music filled the night, harmonicas, fiddles, and songs of the trail. Men danced with women under lantern light, the prairie breeze carrying their joy into the dark. For one night, no one was an outlaw or a lawman. No one was rich or poor. They were simply human, alive, and grateful. Even in the mining camps, where despair was as common as dust, celebrations bloomed. When a miner struck gold or survived a near disaster, his companions would throw a strike supper. They pooled their meager supplies, mixing canned peaches with whiskey, frying salt pork until it sizzled, and toasting their fortune with tin cups raised high. These rough feasts often turned rowdy songs, gave way to brawls, and laughter to snores as men collapsed beside the fire. But they were honest expressions of life. They reminded everyone that in a world so fragile, joy had to be seized before it vanished. Holiday feasts were rare but sacred. Christmas dinners on the frontier were simple yet heartfelt. Families roasted whatever they could find, a goose, a rabbit, or sometimes even a jackrabbit, pretending to be one, and served it with potatoes, biscuits, and the precious sweetness of molasses or honey. Children hung stockings by the hearth, and the glow of the fire softened even the hardest hearts. New Year's Eve meant gatherings at the local saloon, where food and drink flowed freely, and the promise of another year filled with hope, or at least survival, kept spirits high. Food, in these moments, became more than sustenance. It was communion. It was how people reminded themselves that they weren't alone in the vastness of the land. A shared meal meant shared burdens, shared laughter, and shared humanity. That, perhaps, was the greatest gift of the West's simple cuisine. It connected everyone through the primal comfort of eating together. Not every feast, however, was joyous. Funerals, too, had their meals, somber gatherings known as mercy suppers, where friends and neighbors brought food to grieving families. In silence, they shared stews, bread, and coffee, knowing that grief could not be healed, but hunger could be eased. Food became a form of compassion, a silent message that said, "You are not alone." The cycle of life and death, of famine and feast, played out endlessly across the plains. Yet, even in mourning, there was resilience. To eat was to continue, and to cook was to believe in tomorrow. As towns grew, so did their celebrations. Fairs and rodeos introduced contests for the best pies or the most tender beef. Women took pride in their secret recipes, men boasted about their smoked ribs, and children ran between stalls with sticky fingers and full bellies. These gatherings shaped community identities. A small town might become famous for its chili, another for its pies, another for its coffee, strong enough to float a horseshoe. Slowly, the West developed not just a cuisine, but a culture, one that valued honesty, warmth, and hospitality over refinement. There was no pretense in a Western feast. It didn't matter if you were a stranger. If you showed up hungry, someone would hand you a plate. That was the unspoken law of the land, because everyone, at some point, had known what it meant to go hungry. As the century turned and trains brought luxury goods, the nature of Western feasts evolved, but their soul remained unchanged. Fancy tablecloths replaced rough boards, and fine china replaced tin plates. But the spirit of the meal, generosity, gratitude, and survival endured. The Wild West, for all its violence and chaos, had always been about connection, and nowhere was that connection stronger than at the table. In the flickering firelight, under the endless sky, surrounded by the scent of roasted meat and coffee, people found something greater than themselves, a fleeting taste of peace. And long after the last plate was cleared and the last fire burned low, the memory of those feasts lingered, like smoke in the morning air, proof that even in the hardest places, humanity could still taste sweet. If food was the body of the Wild West, then its spirit, both literal and symbolic, flowed through its drinks. The frontier was carved by thirst long before it was shaped by hunger, and the clink of glass was as familiar a sound as the cocking of a revolver. Whiskey, coffee, and water, those three liquids defined life in the West, each representing something vital: courage, comfort, and survival. From dusty saloons to lonely campfires, these drinks fueled dreams, softened sorrow, and offered warmth in a land where mercy was rare. Behind every shot of whiskey and every cup of coffee was a story of struggle, of community, and of how something as simple as a drink could hold the whole soul of the frontier. Whiskey was the West's unofficial currency. It was the medicine, the poison, the bribe, the comfort, and sometimes even the breakfast. A man's worth could be measured by how much whiskey he could hold, or how much he could afford to buy. In the rough saloons that dotted every mining camp and cattle town, whiskey was served from dusty barrels, poured into shot glasses that had rarely seen soap. The quality varied wildly. Some was genuine bourbon, shipped from Kentucky, smooth and amber, but most was rotgut, a brutal mix of raw alcohol, chewing tobacco, and burnt sugar, sometimes spiked with kerosene to stretch the profit. It burned the throat and numbed the soul, but it worked fast, and in a world of pain, that was all anyone asked for. Saloons thrived on it. Fights, friendships, and fortunes began and ended over a glass. Men drank to celebrate, to forget, to warm themselves in winter, or to summon courage when they had none. Whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual. A man stepping into a saloon would nod to the bartender, slap a coin on the counter, and down his shot in one motion. No sipping, no toasts, just a silent agreement between man and bottle. Life is hard, and this helps. For women, whiskey was both temptation and taboo. Some drank it secretly. Others openly defied society's expectations, claiming their right to the same comforts as men. In the quiet corners of boarding houses, widows and working women would share a flask, not for pleasure, but for relief. "It helps me sleep," they'd say. And it did, though not always peacefully. Whiskey blurred pain, dulled memory, and in the long loneliness of the frontier, that was its greatest power. Yet whiskey also built community. Many saloons doubled as town halls, dance floors, and courtrooms, where decisions were made between shots and shouts. Whiskey loosened tongues, sparked laughter, and sometimes ended blood feuds. In its amber depths, people found both ruin and redemption. But when the night gave way to morning, it was coffee that saved the West. The humble black brew was more than a drink. It was a daily resurrection. Cowboys brewed it strong and bitter, boiling grounds directly in kettles over open flames. The result was thick enough to float a horseshoe, but it kept them awake through endless rides and cold nights. The smell of coffee was a promise, the scent of dawn, of work beginning again, of survival continuing one more day. Soldiers, settlers, and miners all swore by it. Some said a camp without coffee was already half dead. Coffee was comfort, warmth, and routine in a life that had none. It didn't just wake the body, it steadied the mind. In a land of lawlessness, coffee was the one civilized act that everyone could afford. Even outlaws paused to pour a cup before heading out to rob a train or ride into a gunfight. There was something sacred in the ritual, grinding the beans, boiling the water, waiting for the steam. It reminded men they were still human, still capable of gentleness, even in a place that demanded brutality. In towns, coffee houses and diners became quiet sanctuaries amid the chaos of saloons. They opened early, serving breakfast to travelers and locals alike, hot biscuits, bacon, and a bottomless cup of black coffee. Unlike whiskey halls, these places welcomed women, children, and the weary. The conversations were softer, the air clearer, and the smell of roasted beans a kind of peace. Some of these establishments were run by widows who had grown tired of saloon life, offering warmth instead of whiskey, conversation instead of confrontation. In a way, they represented the New West, one seeking calm after decades of storm. Water, though, was the rarest and most precious drink of all. In deserts and plains, where rivers ran dry and wells went bad, clean water was more valuable than gold. Travelers carried barrels of it, and many a man was killed over a sip. Towns sprang up wherever water could be found, and those without it quickly withered. To drink cold, fresh water in the West was a blessing few took lightly. It was the taste of life itself, a reminder that no amount of whiskey or coffee could replace what the earth gave freely when it chose to. Native tribes had long known how to find it, reading the land like a map, following birds, or tracing animal tracks to hidden springs. Settlers learned from them, though rarely gave credit. Wells became sacred spaces, places of prayer and gratitude, where families gathered to draw the liquid that meant the difference between thriving and perishing together. Whiskey, coffee, and water told the story of the frontier's evolution. Whiskey symbolized the chaos, the wild, unrestrained energy of a people learning to survive. Coffee symbolized order, the discipline that followed the mornings after madness. And water symbolized endurance, the steady, eternal force that made all of it possible. Every town that grew into a city, every cowboy who lived long enough to tell his tale, owed something to these three drinks. They were the unspoken trinity of the West, the flask, the pot, and the well. As civilization spread, so did refinement. Bottled whiskey replaced barrel brew, and coffee houses became respectable establishments where men discussed politics instead of poker. But even in those polished places, the spirit of the Old West lingered. The first sip of whiskey still burned with the memory of gunsmoke. The first whiff of coffee still carried the dust of the plains. And somewhere, out on the edge of town, an old cowboy still knelt by a creek, cupping water in his hands, tasting the simple, unchanging sweetness of survival. in the end. The West wasn't just built on land or legend. It was built on what people drank to keep going. Every glass raised, every cup poured, was an act of faith. Whiskey gave courage to the reckless. Coffee gave purpose to the weary, and water gave hope to them all. The story of the West wasn't just written in blood and dust. It was written in every drop that touched a parched tongue and said, quietly, live another day. In a world of grit, dust, and danger, sweetness was a rare luxury, a fleeting glimpse of comfort that softened the roughness of frontier life. To taste sugar in the Wild West was to taste civilization itself, a reminder that beneath the calloused hands and hardened hearts, there still lived a craving for tenderness. Desserts in the West weren't the lavish creations of city bakeries. No, elaborate cakes or delicate pastries adorned the tables of saloons or shacks. Instead, they were simple, improvised, and heartfelt, born from scarcity and imagination. Every pie, every cobbler, every piece of candy was a victory against hardship. Proof that even in a land built on survival, people still hungered for a bit of joy. The frontier was not kind to those who sought sweetness. Sugar was expensive and often shipped from faraway ports, arriving in rough brown sacks that shopkeepers guarded like gold. Molasses, honey, or even dried fruit syrup often replaced it. Still, no one complained. They made do, as they did with everything. Women on the frontier became alchemists of flavor, transforming whatever the land offered into moments of happiness. A handful of wild berries, a scoop of flour, a pinch of salt, and a spark of love could create something that made men forget, even briefly, the cruelty of the desert or the loneliness of the plains. Among the most beloved treats were fruit pies and cobblers, warm, bubbling creations that filled cabins with the scent of home. Apples, peaches, blackberries, or even wild plums were wrapped in thick crusts and baked in cast-iron skillets over open fires. These weren't delicate confections. They were hearty, rustic, and meant to feed a crowd. When cowboys rode in from the range, or miners returned from weeks underground, the sight of a pie cooling on a windowsill could draw them faster than any reward poster. A slice of pie, served with a mug of coffee, was the West's version of paradise. Biscuits, too, became desserts when sweetened with honey or molasses. Pioneers often spread thick layers of syrup over hot biscuits, creating makeshift cakes that children adored. When supplies ran low, mothers baked cornbread, sweetened with dried fruit, or even mashed pumpkin, turning necessity into invention. The sweetness was modest, but the satisfaction was immense. Every crumb was earned. The most iconic Western dessert, however, might just be the humble chuckwagon cobbler, a dish born on the cattle trails, cooked by the camp's cookie, the trail chef. This dessert was made by layering canned fruit or dried apples with biscuit dough and baking it in a Dutch oven buried beneath coals. The smell alone could lift spirits after months of beans and salt pork. Cowboys would gather around, spoons in hand, waiting for their share, often arguing about who deserved the first bite. It wasn't just food, it was morale, nostalgia, and gratitude wrapped in a golden crust. In mining towns, sweets became symbols of success. When a miner struck gold, he'd often rush to the nearest bakery, if one existed, to buy a pie or a box of candies to share with his crew. These humble feasts were moments of triumph in a life mostly filled with disappointment. Bakers were among the most respected tradespeople in these towns. Their creations carried hope as much as flavor. Candy, though rare, held a special kind of magic. The simplest sweets, peppermint sticks, molasses, taffy, or rock candy were treasures to children who'd known little more than hardship. A single stick of candy could buy silence, laughter, or forgiveness. Traveling salesmen often carried jars of sweets, using them as bribes or tokens of goodwill. Some stores displayed candy in glass jars, so beautiful that townsfolk stopped just to look, even if they couldn't afford a taste. It wasn't uncommon for mothers to save for months to buy candy for Christmas, wrapping it in paper and hiding it until the big day. The joy it brought, the way a child's eyes lit up, made every hardship worth it. Sweet drinks, too, had their place in the Western diet. Lemonade was a prized refreshment, especially during scorching summers. Lemons were rare, but when available, their juice was stretched thin and sweetened heavily to create a tart, golden treat served at fairs and social gatherings. Sarsaparilla, a root-based soda, became a favorite among both adults and children, offering a non-alcoholic indulgence in saloons. The rich, earthy sweetness of molasses beer and root tea also found popularity among settlers who couldn't afford imported wines. For them, sweetness was more than a flavor. It was a feeling, a fragile reminder that life could still surprise them with kindness. As more women and families settled in the West, baking evolved from survival to artistry. Towns developed bakeries that sold bread by morning and pies by afternoon. The aroma of fresh pastry wafting through dusty streets became a sign that a town was growing, maturing, becoming something more than just a stop on a map. Community events like picnics, church gatherings, and school fundraisers revolved around desserts. Pie socials were especially popular events where women baked their best pies and men bid on them to raise money for local causes. Beyond charity, these socials became courtship rituals. A man who bought a woman's pie was often invited to share it with her. And more than a few frontier romances began over a slice of apple pie. In this way, desserts became symbols of affection and connection, a sweet prelude to a life built together. For those who had nothing, sweetness was found in moments rather than meals. The taste of roasted corn caramelized over a fire, or the chewiness of dried fruit shared among travelers, carried the same joy as any grand feast. Native tribes, too, had their own traditional sweets, like cakes made from crushed berries and nuts or syrup extracted from wild sap. Settlers adopted these recipes, blending them with their own, creating a fusion of flavors unique to the West. Every culture that passed through Mexican, indigenous, Chinese, African, and European left its mark on the Western palate, and nowhere was that more evident than in the shared language of sweetness. By the late 19th century, the arrival of railroads transformed desert culture. Refined sugar became cheaper, imported fruits became common, and chocolate, once a rare delicacy, began to appear in frontier stores. Suddenly, cakes with frosting and layered puddings appeared at weddings and celebrations. Town newspapers proudly published recipes for sponge cake, sugar cookies, and fudge. Women exchanged handwritten recipe cards as tokens of friendship, while young girls learned to bake as part of their dowry training. Even the roughest cowhands began to crave homemade treats, writing in diaries about the fine pie of Mrs. Jenkins, or cookies baked by the widow Evans. Food, especially sweets, had a way of binding people together, erasing loneliness, creating warmth, and giving shape to dreams. When night fell and the work was done, the frontier found comfort not in grand feasts, but in little indulgences: a spoonful of jam, a slice of cake, a memory of home. Around campfires, men would trade stories of the best pie they'd ever eaten, or the taste of their mother's cookies from back east. The yearning for sweetness was universal. It was more than a hunger of the tongue. It was a hunger of the heart. In those moments, the Wild West didn't feel so wild. It felt human, fragile, tender, and full of yearning for something soft amid the steel and dust. So, when historians speak of the West as a land of gunfights and gold, they often forget this gentler truth, that it was also a land of deserts and dreams. Every piece of candy, every pie cooling in a window, was a rebellion against despair. It said, quietly but powerfully, "We are still here. We still have hope." The West was built not only by bullets and whiskey, but by sugar and love, the kind baked slowly, shared freely, and remembered long after the last crumb was gone. As the sun slowly set on the age of the Wild West, the dust began to settle, not only on the roads and cattle trails, but also on the tables where meals had once told stories of survival and grit. The frontier, once a place of lawlessness, hunger, and improvisation, was giving way to towns, cities, and the beginnings of modern America. Yet the food that had sustained the West rough, simple, and full of spirit refused to disappear. Instead, it transformed, taking the soul of the frontier and weaving it into the nation's growing culinary identity. The legacy of Wild West food was not written in cookbooks or menus, but in the habits, values, and tastes of the people who lived through it. Every biscuit, steak, stew, and cup of coffee left an imprint on the American table, shaping the way future generations would eat, share, and remember. The final flavor of the West was not one of spice or sweetness, but of endurance, a taste of freedom forged in hardship and shared in fellowship. When the railroads began stretching their iron veins across the continent, everything changed. Goods once considered luxuries, sugar, spices, flour, coffee, even fruit, flowed freely into the frontier, and the rough diet of necessity slowly became a cuisine of choice. Towns grew around train stations, bringing restaurants, bakeries, and hotels that blended frontier recipes with urban sophistication. Dishes like chicken fried steak, chili con carne, and cornbread, once humble staples of cowboys and settlers, began appearing on menus in cities from Chicago to San Francisco. What was once called trail food now became a point of pride, a symbol of American strength and ingenuity. The Wild West had taught people how to make something out of nothing, and that spirit became the foundation of American comfort food. The ingredients may have changed, but the heart, the simplicity, the warmth, the sense of togetherness stayed the same. The saloon, too, evolved. Once smoky dens of vice and violence, many turned into respectable taverns and social clubs as families moved westward. The whiskey remained, but it was now poured beside meals instead of misery. The raucous chaos of the old barroom gave way to conversation, music, and even dining. Saloons began serving full meals, steaks, beans, potatoes, and bread, the same food that once fed weary travelers, now enjoyed by families celebrating a night out. These changes reflected a larger truth. The Wild West had become civilized, but it never forgot its roots. The foods that had filled its dusty kitchens and campfires were elevated, yet they remained honest, never losing their rustic heart. Even in grand hotels, chefs borrowed from the frontier, baking pies in cast-iron pans for authenticity, or smoking meats over mesquite wood to capture that unmistakable Western flavor that the cowboy, once a symbol of independence and rough living, became a culinary icon. Cookbooks and magazines of the early 1900s romanticized his meals, publishing recipes for chuck wagon beans, cowboy coffee, and range stew. What had been the simplest sustenance of working men now turned into cultural nostalgia, a way for urban Americans to taste the past. People who had never seen a desert or ridden a horse could experience a bit of the frontier by recreating its meals at home. The marketing of Western flavor began, and soon everything from canned beans to barbecue sauces carried the imagery of cowboys and open skies. The frontier's food had become a myth, one that people could buy, cook, and share. Barbecue especially grew from its Western roots into a national obsession. The slow-cooked meats of cattle drives and ranch celebrations evolved into regional traditions. Texas perfected its brisket. Kansas City added sweet sauce. California brought in Spanish and native influences, blending smoke and spice in new ways. Each region claimed to hold the true taste of the West, but all of them shared the same ancestry: the pit fires of cow camps, the mesquite smoke, the long nights of waiting while meat turned tender over embers. What began as a necessity, a way to feed many with little, became an art form. Barbecue wasn't just cooking, it was storytelling through fire. Even breakfast, that simple, hearty start to a long day on the frontier, became a cornerstone of American identity. Bacon, eggs, biscuits, and black coffee, the same meal that once powered cowhands through miles of dust, became a comfort eaten in diners across the nation. The smell of frying bacon, the sizzle of eggs, the warmth of coffee, these sensations carried the memory of the West into every kitchen. The American breakfast, like the people who ate it, was straightforward, dependable, and made to last. It spoke of work, endurance, and quiet satisfaction. That's why even today, no matter how modern life becomes, that old frontier breakfast remains a ritual, a moment of strength before the day's journey begins. As the 20th century unfolded, the memory of the Wild West faded into legend, yet its flavors endured. Immigrants brought their own spices and recipes, mixing them with the rough simplicity of Western fare. Mexican and indigenous ingredients, corn, beans, chilies, tortillas, fused with European methods, creating Tex-Mex cuisine, a lasting culinary child of the frontier. Chinese laborers who had built the railroads opened restaurants serving both stir-fries and beef stews, bridging two worlds on a single plate. African-American cooks, who had often been the hands behind chuck wagons and ranch kitchens, passed down the techniques of smoking and seasoning that would define Southern barbecue and Western soul food alike. The frontier, which had always been a place of blending of people, cultures, and flavors, continued to feed the melting pot of America long after its gunfights had ended. Even the way Americans thought about eating came from the West. The idea that food should be hearty, unpretentious, and communal, that meals should be shared outdoors, around fire and laughter, was born there. The campfire became the ancestor of the backyard barbecue, the chuck wagon, the prototype for the food truck. Festivals celebrating chili, barbecue, and cowboy cooking still draw crowds, not just for the food, but for the feeling, that faint echo of freedom that the West left behind. The act of cooking outdoors, of gathering with friends under the sky, carries something ancient and familiar. It's the same warmth the pioneers felt when they gathered around a fire after a long day's journey, sharing bread and stories while the stars watched silently above. But the West's culinary legacy wasn't just about flavors. It was about values, resourcefulness, gratitude, sharing, the ability to find beauty in scarcity. These were the invisible ingredients that flavored every meal. When settlers shared stew with strangers, when a miner offered his last biscuit to a friend, when a mother baked a pie from the last of her flour, those acts of generosity became part of the American soul. The West taught a hungry nation that food was more than nourishment. It was connection. It was humanity. And that lesson endured. Long after the last frontier closed, by the time the old cowboys had become grandfathers and the saloons had turned into cafes, the West had already transformed the American appetite. Fast food, roadside diners, and family barbecues, all of them carried a trace of that frontier spirit. Even modern dishes, wrapped in convenience, owe something to the resilience of those who once cooked with nothing but fire, hope, and a few dry rations. Every hamburger grilled in a backyard, every coffee poured at dawn, every pie cooling on a windowsill, they all whisper of the same story, that once, a long time ago, people learned to make life bearable in a wild land through the simple act of sharing food. And so, the taste of the Wild West never truly vanished. It lives on in the way Americans eat, celebrate, and remember. In the crackle of a campfire, the aroma of coffee, the sweetness of pie, the laughter around a meal, the spirit of the frontier lingers. The Wild West was never just a place. It was a way of living, a way of feeding both body and soul against the odds. The food of that era taught endurance, kindness, and joy in small things, lessons still baked into every loaf, brewed into every cup, and grilled into every steak across the nation. Its flavor, smoky, strong, and a little wild, remains the true taste